when Europe's armies returned from Naples in 1495, they brought home more than victory. They carried an invisible invader that would terrorize the continent for centuries. This new plague struck not with bubonic swellings, but with suppurating sores that devoured flesh and bone alike. Kings, cardinals, and commoners fell equally to its merciless progression through blood. As physicians scrambled for mercury cures worse than the disease itself, nations blamed each other for the French sickness, the Italian disease, the Spanish evil. In this first documented pandemic of syphilis, a microscopic spirochete revealed how intimacy itself could become weaponized, forever changing how humans viewed the consequences of desire. The winter of 1494 was mild across much of Italy. In Florence, the Arno ran low, revealing smooth stones burnished by centuries of feet. Painters and philosophers filled the air with argument. Apprentices raced along narrow alleys with pigments and parchment under their arms. The Renaissance was in bloom, and Europe seemed to believe in its own invincibility. It was an age convinced that beauty itself could drive out darkness, that reason, geometry, and the grace of the human form had finally conquered the chaos of the medieval world. No one could yet imagine that the very body, perfected on frescoes and marble, was about to become a battlefield. In Paris, King Charles VIII dreamed of conquest. He was 24, thin-faced and restless, the first monarch of France to think not merely of his own kingdom, but of empire. His courtiers whispered of omens and visions, that God had marked him for greatness. Across the Alps, Italian princes trembled. Milan schemed against Florence, Florence against Rome, Rome against Naples. Every city glittered and plotted in equal measure, cathedrals rising while alliances crumbled, silver flowing even as streets filled with beggars. The wealth of Europe had become a fever, and fever always seeks a host. Far to the west, the ocean had ceased to be a mystery. 3 years earlier, a Genoese sailor had returned from lands unseen by Europe since the dawn of time. He brought tales of golden islands and gentle peoples, of spices and strange fruits, of naked men and women who worshipped the sun. His ships carried parrots, pearls, and the seed of something far more enduring. It would not be long before this invisible passenger found its way into the veins of kings and soldiers alike. On the Italian mainland, every road was alive with movement. Mercenaries from the north tramped toward contracts under foreign banners, their armor clattering like loose coins. Inns were crowded with Flemish crossbowmen, German pikemen, and Spanish adventurers, all waiting for word of the next campaign. Prostitutes followed in their wake, setting up tents of canvas and perfume beside military camps. Where soldiers went, commerce followed. Cooks, sutlers, thieves, and gamblers. Each man brought the dust of distant lands on his boots, and with it, the unseen contagions of his age. Yet in the courts of Europe, no one saw disease as the enemy. The real war was dynastic. Across marble halls and candle-lit chambers, ambassadors argued about Naples, the jewel of the south, rich and unstable. A throne so contested it seemed to invite ruin. Naples stood as both prize and warning. Whoever ruled there could command the Mediterranean, but he would inherit a city divided between saints and sinners, poets and mercenaries, splendor and decay. To the young king of France, it was destiny itself. Beneath that grandeur, ordinary life carried on with deceptive serenity. In Florence, merchants spoke of art as though it were a form of currency. Goldsmiths weighed the souls of patrons in ducats. Sculptors searched for patrons who could afford immortality in marble. Scholars debated the nature of man, while plague pits from the previous century still yawned beneath the cobbles. Humanity had survived the Black Death, survived famine and schism, and so believed itself cured of the past. But history has a way of disguising its next catastrophe in the language of triumph. Southward, in Naples itself, the court of King Alfonso's line glittered like a fever dream. The palaces of the Aragonese kings were filled with music and ceremony. Courtiers wore silks embroidered with pomegranates, the symbol of fertility and conquest. Lovers exchanged verses steeped in the language of desire, an art that turned sin into elegance. Yet in the poorer quarters, the same city reeked of sewage and sweat. Beggars slept under the porticos of churches. The Neapolitan underworld was a labyrinth of vice, a living reflection of the temptations that theology could never quite erase. It was a city that sinned beautifully, and it would pay for beauty in flesh. To the north, Milan played the spider. Ludovico Sforza, its calculating duke, wove alliances as easily as others commissioned paintings. He invited the French to Italy, promising safe passage and support for Charles VIII's claim to Naples, a promise he would soon regret. Behind him worked a genius named Leonardo, who designed weapons as effortlessly as he drew angels. War and art, destruction and creation, both were Renaissance crafts. As the year turned, armies began to move. In Lyon, a host of nearly 30,000 gathered, the largest force Europe had seen since the Crusades. Chroniclers described its magnificence: banners embroidered with lilies of France, trumpeters on white horses, cannon drawn by teams of oxen. There were Swiss pikemen, Gascon archers, Breton knights, and hundreds of women who followed as cooks, laundresses, and lovers. The army was a small world, a moving city of flesh and ambition. Within its ranks, laughter mingled with disease, and disease with desire. News of this army travelled ahead of it like thunder. Italian envoys wrote frantic letters to their patrons, pleading for alliances that shifted week by week. In Rome, Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, watched and waited, weighing sin against advantage. Even he could not yet know that the very sins he tolerated would soon take on a new and terrible form. For in this age, when every city had its brothels and every saint his relics, faith and flesh were never far apart. The Renaissance had reawakened the body, and in doing so, invited its betrayal. Still, Europe felt no shadow. To most, it was an age of light. Printing presses hummed, filling the continent with books and pamphlets. Maps redrew the world each month, adding islands and coastlines like promises. Physicians wrote confidently of humours and celestial influences. Alchemists boasted that they could transmute illness into gold. Even the church began to catalogue sin as if it were a kind of science. The human body had become a study, a curiosity, an instrument of divine geometry. No one yet suspected that it was also the perfect laboratory for disaster. Through all this, the hum of trade never ceased. Ships left Genoa and Venice with spices, silk, and dreams. They returned with gold, rumours, and men who coughed blood. In taverns, sailors whispered of strange fevers in the islands beyond the Western Sea. Some said it was God's punishment for the lusts of Europe. Others claimed it was a new form of leprosy, or a curse carried by the winds. But such stories were drowned in the noise of prosperity. No one listened to sailors when kings were speaking of empire. By the time Charles VIII crossed the Alps in the late autumn of 1494, the machinery of contagion was already set in motion. His army marched in splendor, yet within its ranks burned the invisible spark of ruin. Behind them, Europe exhaled, a continent drunk on invention, art, and conquest, convinced that its age was golden. Ahead lay Naples, and the beginning of the modern world's first great pestilence. It began not with rats or fleas, but with men. And by the following year, their bodies would bear the mark of a new and nameless terror, a plague born not of filth, but of desire itself. When the ships returned, they carried more than gold. Their timbers were swollen with sea salt and rumour, tales of lands so fertile that trees bore fruit year-round, and people so free of shame that they walked unclothed beneath the sun. The men who had crossed the Atlantic with Christopher Columbus came home changed, though none could yet name the change. Their skin was bronzed, their eyes hardened by distance, and on their bodies lingered something that could not be washed away. It would take Europe years to understand what had come back with them, and even then, understanding would not bring mercy. In 1493, when Columbus stepped ashore in Palos de la Frontera, he believed himself a messenger of revelation. He wrote of paradise found, islands scattered like jewels across the Caribbean, inhabited by gentle souls who offered fruit and flesh with equal generosity. Spain read his letters as prophecy. The monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, saw in his words divine confirmation of empire. The church saw new souls for conversion. Merchants saw spice, sugar, and human labor. No one saw disease. No one ever does, until it begins to devour the flesh. The men who had sailed with him were not saints. They had endured months of rot and thirst, their tempers sharpened by confinement and hunger. On the islands, they found a world unguarded, a people curious rather than cautious. Desire crossed the language barrier more easily than prayer or trade. Contact was swift, intimate, and in ways no one could yet measure, catastrophic. When the caravels departed for Spain, they left behind rosaries and steel, and took with them women's laughter, the scent of unknown flowers, and the seed of something neither kingdom nor church could name. In Seville, where the sailors disembarked, the port swelled with the noise of discovery. Street vendors hawked trinkets said to be from Chipangu. Poets sang of new Edens. Apothecaries promised cures for the ailments of the Indies. The air itself seemed charged with possibility. Yet among the returning crew, there were whispers of illness, sores that would not heal, pains that burned like coals beneath the skin. Physicians dismissed them as signs of excess. After all, sailors were notorious for indulgence, but the lesions deepened, and the pain crept into the bones. Those who had once boasted of conquests began to hide their faces beneath scarves. Across the Pyrenees, rumors spread faster than ships could sail. In taverns from Valencia to Lyon, men told of a malady that ate through the body like fire through wax. Some said it came from islands beyond the setting sun. Others claimed it was an old disease resurrected, punishment for Christendom's greed. Physicians reached for the language they knew, humours, vapours, celestial influence, but nothing fit. The illness did not respect class or creed. It struck the noble and the nameless alike, passed from bed to bed with the quiet certainty of sin. Columbus himself remained unaware of the terror attributed to his voyage. He believed in signs, in the guiding hand of Providence. On his second expedition, he brought settlers, priests, and soldiers to carve a Spanish kingdom from the tropical forests. They built forts and burned villages, baptized and enslaved, preached and ravaged. In their journals, the friars wrote of souls saved and of bodies stricken by disease. Yet they never grasped the symmetry of infection, that while Europe's breath brought death to the islanders, the islands had sent back their own invisible retaliation. By the early 1490s, Europe was already a continent of contagion. Plague still flickered through its cities. Leprosy persisted in its margins. The pox was a familiar affliction of soldiers and sinners, but this new disease was something else. more virulent, more personal. It began as pleasure and ended in horror. The body that sinned was the body that suffered, and no relic, no indulgence could redeem it. In the brothels of Barcelona and Naples, in the quarters of soldiers and sailors, it spread with terrible democracy. The scholars of Salamanca argued over its nature. Some whispered of malefic stars. Others claimed it was an ancient pestilence reborn. But a few, bold or perhaps desperate, began to speak of the Indies. They noted that the first sufferers were men of the sea, that the disease followed the routes of conquest and trade. In time, they would call it Morbus Gallicus, the French disease, or the Neapolitan disease, or the Spanish itch, names chosen less to explain than to accuse. No nation would claim ownership of the plague. Every tongue sought another to blame. Meanwhile, the currents of the Atlantic became arteries of exchange. Ships carried not only goods, but transformations. Maize, tobacco, tomatoes, and chocolate crossed eastward. Wheat, horses, and iron crossed west. With them came microbes and myths, invisible travelers that would remake both hemispheres. Historians would later call it the Columbian Exchange, but for those who lived it, it was simply life unfolding at terrible speed. The old world and the new were no longer strangers. They had shared blood. Far across the ocean, the islanders began to die. They had no defense against smallpox, measles, or influenza. Whole villages vanished in silence. Friars wrote of deserted coasts where once the smoke of hearths rose by the hundred. Yet Europe saw only divine favor, proof that God had cleared the land for his chosen empire. None suspected that the contagion was mutual, that somewhere in the bones of returning sailors, a counter-infection was waiting to bloom. The first physicians to study it wrote in horror. In their letters, they described ulcerations that devoured the face, sores that spread like burning coals, bones that warped into grotesque shapes. No plague had ever seemed so deliberate, so moral. It was as if the flesh itself had turned against sin. Men who had once mocked confession now crawled to churches begging absolution. But absolution did not heal. The disease was merciless, intimate, and slow, a punishment that lived beneath the skin. In Spain, Queen Isabella's court debated whether the sickness was divine wrath or diabolical trickery. In the ports, priests blessed the dying in their beds, though few dared touch them. In the universities, scholars dissected cadavers, tracing the patterns of decay. They found lesions in the skull, holes in the palate, scars etched into bone. These were not wounds inflicted by war, but by the body upon itself, an anatomy of guilt. As the fever spread northward, it found fertile ground among the armies of Europe. Soldiers were its perfect hosts, rootless, reckless, and loved by many. From tavern to tent, from woman to woman, it passed unseen, a contagion woven into desire. When the great host of Charles VIII assembled in Lyon, ready to march into Italy, it carried within it the sum of Europe's sins. The disease had crossed the ocean. Now it would cross the Alps. By the spring of 1494, the New World had already begun to haunt the Old. The air in every port smelled of tar, sweat, and expectation. Merchants spoke of endless riches, of gold and godless peoples ripe for salvation. Yet beneath the noise of ambition ran another current, quieter, darker. A few physicians, cautious and unheeded, warned that a new plague had arrived. It was not carried by rats or miasma, but by touch, by pleasure, by love itself. Europe had always feared death. Now it began to fear the body. The road to Italy glimmered with armor. Columns of soldiers stretched for miles through the passes of Savoy. their pikes flashing beneath the pale winter sun. It was not merely an army that crossed the Alps that year. It was Europe in miniature. From the Breton marshes to the Swiss valleys, from the Pyrenees to the Rhine, every language of the continent echoed in the march. Behind them rolled carts piled high with cannon and casks of wine, tents, silks, and cages of songbirds. There were cooks, jesters, surgeons, priests, and prostitutes. It was an army of appetite, and it carried its own doom in its blood. King Charles VIII rode at the head of this living host, slight, pale, and convinced of destiny. His courtiers said he dreamed of Alexander, that he saw Italy as a stage for divine triumph. His ambition was not merely territorial, it was mythic. Naples was his promised crown, its throne his by inheritance of the Angevins. But behind the language of right lay hunger, the same hunger that drove explorers across the sea. Conquest had become Europe's new faith, and Charles was its most fervent believer. In Milan, Duke Ludovico Sforza received the news of the French advance with satisfaction that soon curdled into dread. He had invited the foreign king southward, thinking to use him as a pawn in Italy's ceaseless chess of alliances. Yet as the French columns poured through Lombardy, their banners bright with lilies, Ludovico saw too late that he had summoned something unstoppable. Italy, fractious and vain, had called the storm upon itself. Venice watched from her lagoons, balancing profit and peril. Florence, trembling under the mad sermons of Savonarola, prayed and bargained by turns. In Rome, the Borgia Pope weighed the matter as a merchant might weigh gold, calculating which side would pay most dearly for his favor. Each state trusted to diplomacy, that fragile web spun across a continent that had forgotten how to trust. None saw that diplomacy had already failed, that contagion, political and mortal, was advancing faster than treaties could be signed. In the French camps, life was a pageant. Trumpets blared, banners rippled, and the smell of roasted meat drifted through the air. At night, the soldiers sang and gambled by firelight, their laughter echoing off the dark hills. Among the tents moved women, washerwomen, courtesans, widows disguised as cooks. They sold warmth in whatever form was desired, and the soldiers bought it gladly. The army was a marketplace of flesh, a transient city bound by no law but desire. What none yet understood was that this commerce of bodies was also a commerce of disease. The invisible contagion born in ports and brothels was travelling with them, step for step toward Italy. The roads into Tuscany were lined with astonished peasants. Never had they seen such an army. Cannon drawn by oxen, knights glittering like idols, horses armoured in steel. Chroniclers wrote that the ground trembled under their passage. Yet in the ranks, the first signs of sickness had already appeared. Men complained of ulcers that festered without reason, of pains that pierced the bones, of sores that refused to close. Surgeons treated them with poultices and wine, muttering of bad humours. No one imagined that this was the beginning of something vast. In Florence, the arrival of the French was greeted with both terror and wonder. Savonarola, the Dominican friar whose sermons had turned the city toward fanatic repentance, proclaimed that the invaders were the scourge of God, sent to punish Italy's corruption. When Charles entered the city, his small frame encased in gilded armor, Florentines knelt as if before a saint. He passed through streets hung with garlands, oblivious to the irony that his army, hailed as divine, carried the most profane of afflictions. Behind him marched the future of war, and behind that, the future of suffering. The court of Naples, meanwhile, danced on the edge of ruin. King Alfonso, old and superstitious, spent his nights consulting astrologers, seeking signs in the stars that might avert disaster. His son Ferdinand II prepared the defences with grim efficiency, yet the city's true weakness lay not in its walls, but in its complacency. Naples had become a theatre of excess. Its nobles dined beneath frescoed ceilings, while their servants drank from cisterns fouled by the dead. Poets declaimed of beauty as if it were a shield. The streets reeked of jasmine and decay. When word came that the French had entered Rome without resistance, panic gripped the Neapolitan court. Priests preached repentance. Nobles packed their treasures. The people, too familiar with plague and famine to be surprised by new calamity, merely waited. Naples had seen conquerors before. Normans, Aragonese, Angevins. What was one more? None guessed that the coming invasion would leave behind not just political ruin, but a disease that would define centuries. In early February of 1495, Charles reached the gates of the city. The French artillery, forged in the workshops of Lyon and Tours, reduced its defences in days. The thunder of cannon echoed across the bay, startling flocks of gulls into the sky. Within the walls, chaos reigned. The king fled south. His soldiers deserted, and on the 12th day, Naples fell. Charles entered in triumph, his pale face lit by torches, his armour gleaming like polished bone. He believed himself the master of Italy. In truth, he had opened a wound that would never close. The conquerors found the city intoxicating. They feasted in the palaces of the defeated, bathed in marble fountains, and took the women as spoils of war. Soldiers lounged in courtyards that smelled of citrus and blood. Music filled the nights, and wine spilled like water. For weeks the armies celebrated, forgetting discipline, forgetting even God. In the heat and the press of bodies, the sickness spread. A silent contagion moving from soldier to courtesan, from courtesan to citizen, from love to agony. Among the French surgeons, whispers began. They saw ulcers blooming like flowers on the skin, pustules that ate through flesh, and a stench so vile it clung to the soul. Men who had been laughing at dawn were writhing by nightfall. Their faces swelled, their bones ached as if aflame. Some went mad, tearing at their own skin. Others fled the city in terror, carrying the invisible enemy northward. Naples, once the jewel of Italy, had become the crucible of a new plague. Still, Charles imagined victory. He held court in the ruined palaces, issued decrees, and dreamed of Jerusalem. But his soldiers were dying faster than his scribes could record their names. The same ships that had brought him south now waited to carry home his army, and with them the disease that no wall or prayer could contain. In the narrow streets, Neapolitans whispered a name for it: Il morbo gallico, the French disease. It was a bitter christening, and it would not be the last. When the spring winds rose and the French began their retreat, they left behind a city broken in body and spirit. Naples had fallen, but the contagion had risen. From its harbours and its gutters, from the sweat of soldiers and the breath of lovers, a new plague had been born. It would march north with the army, cross borders faster than diplomacy, and in time redraw the map of Europe. Not in ink, but in scars, Naples had fallen with a sound like thunder. The guns that tore open its walls now stood silent, their bronze mouths crusted with soot. The banners of France hung from every tower, streaming above streets still slick with blood. In the palaces of the Aragonese kings, soldiers feasted among broken statues and looted tapestries. They had come for glory and found paradise. Or so they believed. For within the very hour of conquest, another enemy began to stir. one too small to be seen and too cruel to forgive. In the first weeks, no one noticed. The city was delirious with victory. The French sang in the courtyards, drank from silver goblets, and slept wherever luxury offered itself. Prostitutes crowded the barracks. Merchants returned to hawk wine and figs to the conquerors. The soldiers, still drunk on triumph, mistook the warmth in their blood for passion, not fever. Only later did the pain announce itself, a burning between the thighs, a rash that refused to heal, a strange decay beneath the skin. What began as an itch became an agony. The surgeons were the first to see the pattern. They peeled away bandages and recoiled. Flesh sloughed from bone. Ulcers spread like rot through the groin and mouth. The victims groaned in a language beyond prayer, their bodies turning into maps of corruption. No plague had ever looked like this. It did not blacken the skin like the pestilence of old. It blossomed instead, a terrible flowering of the flesh. Within days, whole companies were unfit for battle. Men hid their sores and cursed the women who had warmed their beds. Panic followed swiftly. Rumors multiplied like maggots. Some swore it was leprosy reborn. Others whispered that the Neapolitans had poisoned the wells. The priests called it divine punishment for lust, a chastisement sent by God against the French invaders. But the disease was indifferent to borders. It touched victors and vanquished alike, soldiers and citizens, women and their newborns. The courtyards of Naples filled with the stench of suppuration, and still the songs of triumph echoed faintly over the moans of the dying. Among those who recorded the horror was Niccolo Squilazzi, a physician from Calabria who had come to treat the wounded. He wrote that the afflicted became so hideous that they inspired terror wherever they went. Their faces erupted in sores, their bones bent beneath invisible pressure. I saw men whose very skulls seemed to melt, he noted, and whose cries were like those of the damned. His quills broke under the force of his disgust. To describe the disease was to feel complicit in its obscenity. Charles VIII still imagined himself master of Italy. From the terraces of Castel Capuano, he gazed upon a conquered city, unaware that the victory beneath him was rotting from within. Courtiers kept their distance from the sick, whispering prayers into scented cloths. Yet the contagion spread even among the king's own retinue. Pages, cooks, and grooms began to fall ill. One chronicler described a captain who, after nights of indulgence, found his body covered in ulcers and his genitals eaten away. He threw himself into the sea rather than face the slow decomposition that awaited him. Such stories traveled faster than the army itself. In the taverns, the Neapolitans named it Il Morbo Gallico, the French disease. The insult carried its own logic. Foreign soldiers, foreign sin, foreign retribution. But when the French themselves began to return northward, they carried the infection as both curse and banner. To them, it was the Neapolitan disease, a poison born of southern corruption. Every nation would rename it to suit its pride, yet none could deny its presence. The new plague cared nothing for language. It was Europe's first truly common tongue. The physicians were helpless. They prescribed purges, fumigations, baths in vinegar and wine. Some turned to Mercury, the alchemist's element, whose vapors promised purification. Men were sealed in chambers heated until sweat poured from their bodies, while attendants smeared their skin with quicksilver ointments that burned and blinded. Few survived the cure, fewer still the disease, but desperation made martyrs of all. Naples became a vast infirmary, its churches filled with the stench of salves and incense, its prayers rising in vain. Beyond the city walls, the countryside emptied. Peasants fled at the sight of French banners, believing the soldiers to be cursed. Corpses were left unburied, their sores crawling with flies. In the harbours, sailors refused to unload ships. Merchants abandoned their goods rather than risk contagion. For the first time in living memory, Naples fell silent. The bells that had rung for conquest now tolled for confession. Among the French, the retreat began in haste. Charles, alarmed by the news that his allies were turning against him, ordered the army north. The soldiers obeyed, dragging with them not only their loot, but their infection. They left behind a city emptied of laughter and filled with echoes. The disease lingered in its alleys like smoke. Even the wind seemed tainted. Within weeks of their departure, Neapolitan women bore children whose bodies were already marked. Infants with sunken noses and weeping sores, proof that the plague had learned to outlive its hosts. As the army marched homeward, the sickness spread ahead of it, carried by touch and breath, by coin and kiss. Towns that welcomed the French soon regretted their hospitality. Inns filled with groaning soldiers, villages burned their beds. Yet the disease was a master of disguise. It could sleep for months within the blood, then wake in sudden fury. What the soldiers carried northward was not simply an illness, but a prophecy. That the age of discovery had uncovered not only new worlds, but new torments. In Naples, the survivors began to rebuild. The dead were buried in mass graves beyond the city walls. Priests blessed the earth, though even they hesitated to touch the shrouds. Artists painted saints shielding the faithful from invisible arrows. Physicians wrote treatises that mixed science and superstition in equal measure. And always, the same question returned. What had they done to deserve this? No one could answer. Yet in the private whispers of the afflicted, one certainty spread, that the disease was born of desire itself, the child of pleasure and punishment. It was a mirror held up to the Renaissance, radiant beauty concealing rot beneath the skin. The plague of Naples had no need for rats or fleas. It needed only the oldest contagion of all, the human touch. By the time the last French banners vanished beyond the northern hills, the city lay hollowed, its palaces silent, its fountains clogged with weeds. The conquerors were gone, but their legacy remained, carried in blood and breath across a continent. What had begun as victory now moved unseen through Europe's veins, patient and unstoppable. The Renaissance had given birth to many wonders, art, discovery, ambition, and now to its first great monster. The French army left Naples in the spring of 1495, dragging its cannon through mud and corpses. The air behind them stank of smoke and disease. From the city's shattered gates, beggars watched the soldiers vanish northward, a gleaming serpent of men and horses winding up the coastal road. What they carried was not gold or victory, but infection. Within their bodies, the new plague pulsed like a second heartbeat. Charles VIII marched in haste. The Italian states had turned against him. Alliances once spun in silk had hardened into chains. Venice, Milan, and the papacy now moved to crush the invader they had summoned. Yet the enemy that would destroy Charles's army was already among them, invisible, patient, tireless. The soldiers sang to keep fear at bay, but beneath their laughter came the coughing, the groans, the scraping of sores. In the night camps, where fires flickered against tent walls, pain whispered louder than prayer. Each morning brought new desertions. Men awoke fevered, their flesh blistered with ulcers that wept pus through the bandages. Others limped on swollen legs. their bones warped by the disease's relentless assault. Surgeons hacked away infected tissue with knives red hot from the flames, but the sickness always returned. It ate through muscle, through dignity, through courage. When the dying begged to be left behind, their comrades obliged. The roads of Italy became graveyards, unmarked but unforgettable. In the villages the army passed, doors were barred, wells were sealed. Peasants crossed themselves as the soldiers trudged by. Foreigners, hungry and poxed, their armor rusted by sweat. Mothers dragged their children indoors, whispering that the French were cursed. Priests sprinkled holy water over crossroads, as if the disease could be fooled by ritual. But nothing stopped its passage. It lingered in every tavern and brothel, on every coin, in every kiss. At Fornovo, the French found themselves trapped between the swollen banks of the Taro River and a coalition army determined to avenge Naples. The battle that followed was chaos. Rain, cannon smoke, screams, the clash of armor in the dark. By dawn, thousands lay dead or dying, and the French barely escaped. Charles called it victory, but his men were too weak to cheer. The living marched on, coughing blood, their wounds festering. The Italian dead were stripped and burned, yet even the flames could not purify what had begun. As the army staggered across the Alps, it left fragments of itself behind. Mercenaries who deserted in Lombardy, wounded soldiers who took shelter in convents or brothels, captains who sought comfort in taverns. Each encounter became a new infection. The disease leapt from camp to city, from soldier to lover, from lover to child. Within months, it reached France. By winter, it was in Switzerland and Germany. By spring, Spain. Europe's veins had opened, and the contagion poured through. In Paris, physicians first dismissed the reports as exaggerations. A few soldiers returning from Italy had sores, yes, but war bred filth. Yet the cases multiplied. Barber surgeons whispered of patients whose faces collapsed into ulcers, whose skulls showed the telltale pits of rot. They called it La Maladie de Naples, the Neapolitan disease, and congratulated themselves that it was foreign. The same delusion spread elsewhere. In Italy, it was the French disease. In Germany, the Spanish pox. In Poland, the German disease. In the Ottoman Empire, the Christian one. Every border was an accusation. By 1496, the epidemic moved faster than news itself. Traders carried it along the Rhine. Soldiers spread it across the Pyrenees. Pilgrims brought it to the shrines of France. Inns filled with men whose faces were bound in rags, their skin marked by black ulcers. Town councils issued decrees forbidding prostitutes from the streets, though most knew it was far too late. The contagion traveled by touch, by trust, by longing. There was no defense against the oldest impulse of humankind. In Geneva, a chronicler wrote, "It is a new plague, and yet not new, for it punishes old sins." He described men whose flesh fell from the bones as wax from a candle. In Spain, sailors blamed the disease on heretics. In Flanders, priests urged repentance. But the suffering was democratic. Courtiers and beggars alike bore the same marks. The Renaissance, that proud age of rebirth, had found a new reminder of mortality. The human form, once idolized in marble, was now a warning. Mercenaries carried the plague eastward, their pay spent, their wounds unhealed. In Germany, it swept through garrisons and market towns, leaving behind hospitals overflowing with the diseased. Physicians refused to enter. The stench of rotting flesh filled the streets. In Switzerland, the sickness invaded the monasteries. In Spain, it struck the sailors of Seville and the prostitutes of Cadiz. Even in distant England, where news of the Naples campaign arrived as rumor, the first sufferers appeared by the end of the decade. The pestilence had become a traveler. Yet amid the horror, something else began to take shape. The first stirrings of a medical awakening. Scholars who had long worshipped Galen's humours found themselves confounded. No alignment of stars, no imbalance of bile, could explain the disease's cruelty. Physicians began to observe rather than recite. They recorded symptoms, tested treatments, debated cause and contagion. From Naples's ruins, a strange modernity was being born. But for the living, there was no solace in knowledge. The disease mutilated slowly. It could sleep for years before returning, eating deeper, hollowing faces, deforming limbs. Lovers hid their scars beneath veils and powders. Soldiers wrapped their sores in rags. The word pox entered language as both diagnosis and curse. It was not merely a sickness of the body, but of trust, the corruption of intimacy itself. When Charles VIII finally reached Lyon, his army was a shadow of the host that had once thundered into Italy. The banners were torn, the cannon abandoned. Of the 30,000 who had crossed the Alps, fewer than half survived. The king called for thanksgiving masses, but even in the incense-scented cathedrals, men coughed behind their hands. The disease was already among them, waiting for its next host, its next confession. And somewhere far to the south, in Naples, the streets had grown quiet again. Grass sprouted between the stones where soldiers had bled. The city's bells tolled as they always had, for war, for victory, for death. Naples had become a wound that Europe could not stop reopening. The French had gone, but their presence lingered in the skin of strangers, in the bones of newborns, in the silence that follows ruin. The Great March was over. The plague had no need for armies anymore. It would travel on its own, through desire, through love, through the very act of being human. Europe awoke to the news as though from a fever dream. A new disease, monstrous in form and ungovernable in nature, spreading from Naples to Paris, from Paris to the world. In the years that followed, panic became its own contagion. Physicians, scholars, and alchemists all fought to define the unnameable. They drew diagrams of corruption, debated the humours, and prayed to be spared. For a continent that had just rediscovered the beauty of the body, the Great Pox was an insult written in flesh. In Rome, Pope Alexander VI ordered days of fasting and processions through the streets. The banners of saints fluttered above a city terrified of touch. Pilgrims walked barefoot, bleeding from self-inflicted lashes, chanting that lust had brought divine vengeance. Meanwhile, the pontiff's own physicians whispered among themselves that the disease moved not by miracle, but by contact. They could trace it like a map, from soldier to courtesan, from courtesan to noble, from noble to priest. Sin, it seemed, had become measurable. In the medical schools of Padua and Bologna, scholars gathered over corpses. The new anatomy theatres, once built to celebrate the symmetry of God's creation, now became arenas of horror. Students peered at bones that showed strange deformities, holes eaten clean through the skull, limbs bent like bows, ribs scarred as if gnawed by invisible teeth. These were not wounds of battle or plague. They were the record of a different war, one fought within the body itself. The physicians named it Morbus Gallicus, the French disease, for no better reason than pride. Niccolò Squillaci, the Calabrian physician who had witnessed the outbreak in Naples, wrote the first account that dared to describe its true ferocity. Never has there been a sickness more dreadful, he confessed. It rots the flesh, corrupts the bones, and spares neither rank nor virtue. His words, copied and recopied, spread faster than the cure he sought. Across Europe, others followed. Joseph Grünpeck in Augsburg, Jean Fernelius in Paris, and later Fracastoro in Verona. Each tried to impose reason upon chaos, and each failed. The disease refused to fit the categories of Galen or Hippocrates. It obeyed no season, no climate, no sin alone. As the infection multiplied, so did the remedies. Quacks appeared in every market square, promising salvation in powders and potions. Some sold elixirs of gold dissolved in wine. Others prescribed fumigations of sulfur and herbs. But the favored cure was Mercury, the quicksilver of alchemists, that shimmering liquid believed to purify whatever it touched. Patients were shut in heated chambers, their bodies anointed until the skin blistered and peeled. Sweat poured from them as attendants prayed that the poison would drive out the greater poison within. When they emerged, trembling and toothless, they called themselves healed. Few lived long enough to dispute it. In the brothels and infirmaries, the line between cure and punishment blurred. Prostitutes were beaten or branded, accused of carrying the devil's mark. Town councils ordered inspections of women, as if chastity could be measured by candlelight. Physicians, terrified of contagion, examined patients with rods rather than hands. Hospitals for the pox sprang up outside city walls, their windows barred, their air thick with smoke from burning clothes. Inside, the afflicted whispered prayers that mingled with curses. Those who died were buried at night, unblessed and unnamed. Among scholars, the debate turned desperate. Was the disease new or merely newly visible? Some argued that it had existed for centuries, hidden among the leprosaria. Others swore that it had come from the New World, a gift or a revenge from lands beyond God's known creation. Letters flew between courts and universities. In Seville, a physician named Ruy Diaz de Isla wrote that he had treated sailors from Columbus's voyage, men whose bodies bore the first unmistakable signs. They brought back gold, he wrote bitterly, and a sickness that is gold's true shadow. For every skeptic, another believer arose. The pox was either foreign or original sin, reborn. There was no middle ground. Meanwhile, in homes across Europe, the disease worked its quiet devastation. Husbands infected wives. Wives passed it to their infants. Midwives whispered of stillbirths and babies born with ulcerated skin. In convents, nuns tended to the diseased with hands covered in cloth, their prayers trembling between faith and nausea. A few were infected themselves, martyrs to compassion. In the courts, nobles disguised their sores beneath silk and perfume, turning disfigurement into secrecy. The great pox, more than any plague before it, made shame a symptom. Not all turned to despair. A handful of physicians, young and curious, began to doubt the old authorities. They compared notes, kept journals, recorded what they saw instead of what the ancients had written. Observation replaced reverence. One Florentine doctor wrote, "The sickness begins where love begins." It was both diagnosis and heresy. From this uneasy mixture of lust and logic, the first glimmers of modern medicine began to appear, fragile as candlelight, yet alive. In Paris, Joseph Grunpeck, court secretary to Emperor Maximilian, fell ill himself. He described the disease not as punishment, but as warning. "It is not the wrath of God alone," he wrote, "but the corruption of nature." His words scandalized the church, but inspired a generation of natural philosophers. If corruption could be studied, perhaps it could be cured. In this paradox, horror-breeding inquiry, the Renaissance betrayed its own heart. A faith that even in decay, knowledge might still bloom. But for the afflicted, knowledge was no balm. The mercury burned their mouths and loosened their teeth. Their bones softened until they could no longer stand. In the hospitals of Lyon, patients were chained to their beds to keep them from tearing their own skin. In Spain, entire households were driven into the countryside to die unseen. The Great Pox made isolation a virtue. The world learned new distances between the healthy and the sick, between the saved and the damned. By the turn of the century, the disease had become an institution. Every city had its ward for the poxed, every physician his theory. The moralists preached chastity, the alchemists distilled vapors, the sufferers endured. Across Europe, the scent of Mercury hung in the air like penance, and still the sores bloomed, and still the bones warped. Humanity had mapped the stars but could not cure itself. The physicians, in their pride, gave the disease 100 names. The poor needed none. They called it simply the pain. It was the price of touch, the proof of desire, the shadow of the Renaissance itself. By the close of the 15th century, the new plague had gained not one name, but a dozen. In Italy, it was Morbo Gallico, the French disease. In France, Mal de Naples. To the Germans, it was the Spanish pox. To the English, the Great Pox. To the Turks, the Christian disease. The sickness had no homeland, so Europe made one for it, wherever guilt could be laid. Every border became a mirror in which nations saw not themselves, but the corruption of their neighbors. The act of naming was itself a defense, a way to thrust horror beyond one's walls. Cities that had survived plague and famine now fought a war of language. Pamphlets accused foreigners, heretics, prostitutes, or the wrath of God. Physicians traded insults with theologians, each certain that the other misunderstood the nature of the scourge. Yet the disease ignored their quarrels. It passed as easily between lovers as between soldiers. While scholars debated origins, it crept through their households. In Naples, the first city to bear the curse, the people still called it Il male francese and spat the word French as though it were poison. Yet among the French themselves, the term Neapolitan was whispered with equal venom. Each nation absolved itself by naming another. To be infected was shameful. To call the infection foreign was absolution. And so language became the first medicine, useless but comforting, a salve for pride. The printers, newly empowered by their presses, turned panic into profit. Broadsheets appeared in every major city, woodcuts of grotesque bodies covered in sores, poems warning against lust, sermons framed as medical advice. Artists drew the afflicted as monsters, their skin cratered, their faces dissolving, while others painted allegories of love and death entwined. These images spread faster than the sickness, filling taverns and marketplaces. For the first time, disease had a public face. In Nuremberg, an anonymous pamphlet declared that the French disease was God's answer to vanity. It warned that those who adorned their bodies with silk and perfume would find them stripped and eaten from within. The language of sin fused with that of medicine. The body became a moral battlefield. Artists etched skeletons whispering into the ears of courtesans, death and desire inseparable. The Renaissance, which had so celebrated the flesh, now turned upon it with fascination and disgust. Across Europe, city councils issued ordinances to contain what could not be contained. Brothels were shuttered, prostitutes were expelled beyond the walls. Physicians were ordered to examine the women who remained. Those found infected were imprisoned in lazarettos, hospitals that were half infirmary, half prison. In Venice, guards patrolled the canals to keep the poxed from entering. In Florence, officials posted lists of the afflicted, as if shame could stop contagion. It did not. The disease slipped through the gaps between morality and desire. The legal zeal reached absurd extremes. In Strasbourg, a physician proposed that all infected women be branded with a mark to warn others. In Paris, midwives were required to report newborns showing signs of the pox. Yet even as governments asserted control, the wealthy have found ways to hide their afflictions. Courtiers paid private physicians to disguise the symptoms. Priests absolved the sick in secret. The poor, as always, were left to die in public. Still, the naming spread faster than any cure. In Poland, chroniclers called it the German disease, since the infection had come with traveling mercenaries. The Germans blamed the French the Italians, and the Italians the Spanish. No one asked where it had truly begun. To do so was to admit that it belonged to everyone. The sickness had become a shared denial, a plague of words as much as of bodies. Among scholars, the debate turned to theory. If it was the French disease, why did the French themselves suffer most? If the Neapolitan, why had it crossed the Alps? Physicians began to suspect that it had no single birthplace. Some whispered of the New World, the islands newly discovered by Columbus. Others insisted it had always been among them, dormant, waiting for war and lust to awaken it. Their arguments filled volumes, but the disease paid them no attention. It moved in the silence between sentences. In the courts, the epidemic became a scandal that etiquette could not conceal. Ambassadors wrote cautiously of certain indispositions affecting noble households. Kings employed personal physicians sworn to secrecy. At banquets, women covered their faces with veils of lace. Men wore gloves, even in private. Intimacy became a negotiation of risk. The French court, ever inventive, turned discretion into an art form. Rumor became the only reliable diagnosis. Meanwhile, the common people gave the disease a simpler name: the pox. It required no nationality, no theology, no pretense. The pox was in the air, in the blood, in the body. It was whispered in confessionals, sung about in taverns, cursed in the streets. The word itself seemed to carry contagion, spoken only in fear. To say pox was to acknowledge that the world had changed. Some tried to reclaim it through humor. Ballads mocked soldiers for their French roses. Poets compared lovers' lips to ulcers, jesting that Cupid's arrows were tipped with poison. But beneath the laughter lay terror. Parents warned their sons that pleasure was death in disguise. Mothers wept for daughters marked by shame they did not earn. The disease had entered the language of sin, and from there it would never depart. In the universities, the young physician Paracelsus began to write his defiance of the old authorities. "It is not in the stars that men are corrupted," he said, "but in their own bodies." He called the sickness morbus venereus, the disease of Venus, linking it not to nations, but to love itself. His words were scandalous, but prophetic. In time, the name would change again. Scholars would speak of Syphilis, after a mythic shepherd cursed by the gods. Yet beneath every title, the same agony endured. By the turn of the century, Europe had run out of scapegoats. The French disease, the Neapolitan disease, the Spanish pox, all had become one. The great pox was no longer foreign. It was European, human, inevitable. The names remained only as echoes of accusation, reminders of a time when ignorance passed for purity. What the people called it no longer mattered. The plague had found its truest name in silence. Once the shouting stopped, silence began to spread. The proclamations, the ordinances, the furious naming of guilt, all faded into a weary acceptance. The great pox had become part of life, as ordinary as hunger or prayer. In the cities that had once howled for repentance, people now simply lived with it. It was in their families, in their neighbors, in their blood. The miracle was not that so many died, but that so many continued to live. The early years of the new century brought a strange calm. The disease no longer tore through the flesh like fire. Instead, it smoldered. Physicians noted that its course had changed. The fierce, ulcerating agony of the 1490s had softened into something slower, less dramatic, but more enduring. It lingered in the joints, in the nerves, in the face. The bones thickened and warped. The skin cracked and scarred, but did not always kill. To some, it seemed that nature herself had grown tired of cruelty. Others feared the opposite, that the pestilence had learned to wait. Hospitals filled with ghosts of the living. In the wards of Lyon and Seville, the pox lay in long rows beneath stained ceilings, whispering confessions into the dark. The old leper houses, emptied when that ancient disease had waned, now took in new tenants. Their windows were shuttered, not against contagion, for contagion was everywhere, but against shame. Visitors described the smell as unforgettable, a sweetness of rot that clung to the soul. Physicians entered only with their faces wrapped in linen and their consciences wrapped in scripture. The sufferers came from every rank. Veterans returned from wars to find their bodies foreign to them. Artisans, once strong, found their hands trembling too violently to work. Women hid their lesions beneath linen collars, their beauty dissolving beneath powders of chalk. In Venice, courtesans who had once ruled salons now limped through the alleyways, veiled and shunned. The pox had become a quiet equalizer, not swift enough to terrify as plague had, but persistent enough to humiliate everyone. Mercury remained the chosen remedy, though its cure was often deadlier than the disease. Patients were sealed in sweating rooms, their mouths filled with the metallic taste of poison. Teeth fell out, hair came away in clumps. Madness followed in shivering fits. Yet men continued to seek it, for to refuse treatment was to admit defeat. Apothecaries grew rich. Miners in the mountains of Almaden dug mercury from the earth with bare hands, unaware that their lungs filled with the same invisible killer they sold to others. Every cure bred another sickness. In the colonies across the ocean, another remedy emerged. The wood of a strange tree brought from the Indies. They called it Guaiacum. Boiled in water, it produced a bitter draught, said to cleanse the blood. The church endorsed it, merchants marketed it, and the desperate drank it by the gallon. For a while, Europe's ports smelled of the wood's resinous sweetness. When it failed, as it often did, doctors said the patient lacked faith. In every remedy, there was a sermon. Women bore the cost in silence. Wives tended to husbands whose bodies decayed in secret. When they too fell ill, no one pitied them. Midwives began recording strange births. Infants with swollen bellies, skin marbled with sores, bones already bent. They baptized the dying before their mothers could hold them. Theologians argued whether these children were innocent or already condemned. A few, less pious and more honest, whispered that the sickness punished no one. It simply continued, indifferent and tireless. In convent infirmaries, nuns cared for the infected when others would not. They washed sores, burned linens, and murmured psalms as the dying raved. Some succumbed, their vows of purity fulfilled in martyrdom. The records speak plainly. Sister Caterina expired in the odor of sanctity and of Mercury. For every saintly death, 100 unrecorded ones filled the paupers' pits outside city walls. The age that had adored beauty now kept its ugliness hidden underground. Art changed. Painters who once celebrated flawless flesh began to turn away from it. faces grew more severe, more spiritual. In engravings, death reappeared as an old companion, his hand resting not on the poor, but on the noble. Albrecht Dürer drew skulls and twisted figures. Bruegel's peasants danced beneath skies heavy with meaning. The great pox had entered the imagination. Even when it was not painted, it was felt. In the shadowed eyes of Madonnas, in the melancholy of portraits that pretended to health. Economy followed sickness. The cost of treatment bankrupted families. Soldiers too ill to fight swelled the ranks of beggars. The trade in Mercury and Guaiacum grew so vast that merchants spoke of the silver sickness, for it enriched them as it ruined others. In Antwerp, entire warehouses were filled with casks of the sacred wood, stacked like relics. Healing had become commerce, and pain its most reliable currency. Physicians, cornered by their own ignorance, turned to philosophy. Some argued that the disease had softened because Europe itself had changed, that the first storm had spent its rage upon an unprepared world. Others believed it divine mercy or divine mockery. Paracelsus, still defiant, wrote that the body could heal itself if freed from fear. He spoke of balance, of transformation, of the poison as teacher. But for most, the lesson was cruelly simple. The pox no longer killed quickly because it had no reason to hurry. By mid-century, its presence was everywhere and nowhere. It was whispered in marriage negotiations, disguised in poetry, feared in silence. The physicians could describe it in Latin, the priests in sermons, the artists in allegory, and yet no one could look it in the eye. The great pox had ceased to be an event. It had become a condition of being alive. When the disease refused to vanish, people decided that God had chosen not to. Physicians might trace it through the body, but preachers mapped it through the soul. From pulpits across Europe came the thunder of explanation. This new affliction, slow and intimate, was not merely punishment, but revelation. A mirror held up to human desire. The great pox became the handwriting of heaven upon the flesh. In Florence, Savonarola's ghost still haunted the churches. His disciples proclaimed that the pestilence was proof of prophecy fulfilled, that Italy's beauty had curdled into sin. They pointed to the frescoes of bare-limbed saints, the music, the perfumes, the painted smiles, evidence that vanity had invited damnation. In their sermons, the sores of the body mirrored the sores of the spirit. When the faithful shuddered, it was not only from fear of infection, but of recognition. Elsewhere, the tone softened, but the message remained. In Seville, friars carried crucifixes through the streets, chanting that lust had opened the gates of contagion. In Paris, confessors instructed their penitents to name not only their sins, but their symptoms. The act of confession blurred with diagnosis. Each lesion was an indictment, each scar a visible form of guilt. The doctors had Latin, the church had parable. Both spoke of corruption. Only the vocabulary differed. Painters followed suit. Images of Saint Roche, once invoked against the plague, began to reappear in new guises. No longer the protector of the poor, but the example of divine endurance. Artists filled altarpieces with saints pointing to their wounds, as if to say, "This is how we are saved, by suffering." Even the Virgin took on a darker beauty, her eyes shadowed, her skin pale as ash. The Renaissance had taught artists to adore the body. The pox taught them to doubt it. Priests warned that the disease moved not through air, but through sin. Brothels were renamed houses of perdition. Women who had once been courtesans became scapegoats. Some were burned, others paraded naked through the streets, their heads shaven as public medicine. The crowd watched, half disgusted, half enthralled. To condemn was safer than to pity. The moral cure required spectacle, but guilt was not easily contained. Husbands brought the infection home to wives who had never strayed. Wives bore children already marked. When the midwives whispered that the disease had touched the innocent, the sermons grew more desperate. How could purity suffer for another's desire? Some theologians declared it proof that the world was nearing its end, that corruption had entered even the womb. Others argued that God's mercy lay hidden within punishment, that the child's suffering redeemed the parent's sin. These were explanations meant to console the living, not to absolve the dead. In monasteries, the moral language faltered. Records from southern Italy describe friars afflicted by the very plague they condemned. Some claimed it came from nursing the sick. Others, more honest, confessed to the same desires as any man. Chroniclers wrote of holy men who prayed with their bodies unguarded. The disease had no respect for vows. In its presence, chastity became another word for denial. Among the people, superstition flourished. Pilgrims traveled to shrines where relics promised protection. The bones of saints who had once healed lepers, fragments of the true cross, vials of oil said to glow when touched by the faithful. Vendors sold amulets inscribed with verses. Women wore charms of copper and coral against infection. The church tolerated such practices, preferring superstition to despair. Better to buy salvation than to surrender to it. Yet not all the faithful accepted punishment as explanation. A quieter theology began to take shape, one that saw in the disease a kind of kinship with Christ's passion. The suffering, they said, was not wrath but participation. To endure the pox was to share in the wounds of the Saviour. This belief spread through the hospitals, whispered by nurses and priests who had seen too much death to believe only in anger. They spoke of pain as transformation, of corruption as grace. The afflicted clung to the idea that their agony had meaning, that rot could be holy. In Germany, woodcuts circulated showing death courting a courtesan, his skeletal arm draped around her shoulders. She smiled at him, unafraid, as if to suggest that sin and salvation were finally lovers. Poets took up the image, writing of beauty turned to ruin, of pleasure that carried its own judgment. The disease had entered the imagination so deeply that even morality became infected. To suffer was shameful, but also strangely sublime. Still, the hierarchy of blame persisted. The church forgave kings and condemned prostitutes. Physicians absolved soldiers and scorned their companions. Every class found a way to see the pox as belonging to someone else. The only true equality lay in the graves outside the city walls, where bones of rich and poor alike bore the same scars. As the 16th century advanced, the preacher's fury cooled into habit. The great pox was no longer a sign of the world's end, only of its continuity. Sermons turned from apocalypse to instruction. Be temperate, be faithful, be clean. The disease had become an institution of morality, an unspoken article of faith. Every confession carried its ghost. And yet, beneath all the sermons and decrees, a quieter fear endured, that this affliction, so intimate and persistent, might not be punishment at all. Perhaps it was simply human nature laid bare, the proof that the body, for all its divine design, was still made of earth. The faithful prayed harder. The sinners sinned anyway. Between them both, the pox continued its patient work, indifferent to virtue, equal in its judgment, tireless in its mercy. When faith failed, chemistry took its place. Across Europe, the sick turned to their physicians, and the physicians turned to their furnaces. Smoke rose from the laboratories of apothecaries and alchemists alike, a new incense for a new religion, the worship of cure. The great pox had stripped the body of its innocence. Now men sought redemption, not through prayer, but through experiment. If the plague was divine, then perhaps knowledge was the rebellion God secretly desired. Mercury became the gospel of hope. The shimmering liquid fascinated physicians who saw in it both purity and poison. It flowed like quicksilver through their imagination, bright, elusive, and deadly. In every city, its price rose with despair. Patients queued outside apothecaries, trembling, coin in hand. The treatment was as brutal as the disease it promised to conquer. The afflicted were shut in sweat chambers, their bodies smeared with ointments that burned like fire. Some were told to breathe the vapor until their mouths frothed and their teeth loosened. The survivors emerged ghost-like, reeking of metal, their clothes soaked in the poisonous sweat that was meant to save them. Doctors justified the cruelty with elegance. What is driven out by poison is purified, they wrote. The idea that poison might cure was an old one, but never had it been tested so literally. Across the continent, physicians burned and boiled their patients with serene conviction. When a sufferer died, it was said he had been treated too late. When he survived, the cure was proclaimed divine. There was no science yet, only ritual dressed in reason. Mercury's empire extended beyond the hospital walls. In the mountains of Almaden and Idrija, miners clawed at veins of red cinnabar, unaware that their lungs filled with death as they worked. The metal they wrested from the earth traveled north in wooden casks stamped with royal seals. Apothecaries handled it with reverence, pouring it into glass vessels as though decanting light itself. For a generation, Mercury was not merely a medicine, but a moral theatre, suffering purified through suffering. Then, like a wind from across the ocean, another cure arrived. Ships from the New World carried logs of dark, fragrant wood, Guaiacum. The conquistadors swore that the native peoples of the Indies used it to treat the same affliction that tormented Europe. Ground into powder and steeped in boiling water, it produced a bitter brew that promised deliverance. Merchants hailed it as a miracle of nature. Priests called it proof of divine providence, God sending the remedy with the sin. For the first time, the cure for a European plague came from a conquered world. The taste was vile, the regimen exhausting. Patients were ordered to drink the potion for 40 days, to sweat in heavy blankets, to abstain from meat, wine, and flesh alike. The faithful obeyed. Some claimed improvement, most merely endured. The wood became a commodity more valuable than silver. In Antwerp and Venice, warehouses brimmed with it. Spanish fleets carried casks marked with crosses, as if they contained relics rather than timber. When the results failed to match the promises, physicians said the merchants had adulterated the product, or that the patient's sin outweighed the virtue of the cure. Amid this fervor, a few men began to ask different questions. Paracelsus, physician, heretic, and alchemist, mocked the healers who bled their patients to death while praying over them. He argued that every poison held its opposite, that the body was not a battlefield of humors, but a vessel of transformation. The physician is servant to nature, he wrote, not her jailer. His students listened, half in awe, half in fear. If disease could be studied rather than exorcised, then medicine might one day become an art of truth instead of faith. The established doctors sneered at his arrogance. They called him a charlatan, a blasphemer, a fool who confused alchemy with theology. Yet Paracelsus was not alone in his heresy. In Padua, young scholars dissected cadavers to study the damage wrought by the pox. They drew the lesions, traced the scars, counted the holes bored into skulls. Knowledge grew out of horror. Each cut was an act of defiance against ignorance. In the flicker of their candles, the future anatomy of Europe was being born. The experimenters' courage came at a price. Some caught the disease through their work. Others were denounced by the church for impiety. Still, they persisted. They boiled mercury with herbs, mixed guaiacum with wine, tested every mineral and plant that rumor praised. The laboratories became theaters of desperation. The smell of smoke and vinegar filled entire streets. For the first time, science began to smell like fear. Among the wealthy, treatment became a performance. Princes built private baths of copper, their water infused with mercury and myrrh. Courtesans floated in scented vapors, while musicians played behind silk screens. The agony was disguised as luxury. When the fever broke, servants burned the sheets and praised God for his mercy. The infection, however, always returned, slower, quieter, crueler. Each relapse proved only that the cure must be repeated. By mid-century, Europe had exhausted its remedies, but not its imagination. Mercury still gleamed on the shelves. Guaiacum still arrived in the holds of Spanish galleons, and yet the disease continued its patient dominion. The learned argued whether the cure should purge or preserve, burn or soothe. In every city, sufferers chose between poison and prayer. There were no miracles, only variations of endurance. And even so, within that long struggle, something irreversible began. The search for healing had forced Europe to observe itself, to look not toward heaven, but into the body. Alchemy, medicine, and heresy had converged into curiosity. The great pox had made knowledge a matter of survival. In the heat of its furnaces, the first true scientists were tempered like metal, scarred, imperfect, but shining nonetheless. Long after the battlefields had quieted and the brothels emptied, the great pox crept upward, from tavern to palace, from soldier's camp to royal chamber. The poor had screamed and died in the open, the powerful learned to suffer in silence. Courtiers cloaked their wounds in silk. Queens covered the smell of rot with ambergris and rosewater. The contagion that once belonged to soldiers now became an unspoken language of the elite, a secret whispered between bedchamber and confessional. In Paris, the court of Charles VIII's successors glittered with wit and perfume. Beneath the laughter, rumor worked harder than any physician. The king's favorites were pale and delicate. They claimed poor digestion, or the Neapolitan wind, to explain their wasting faces. Physicians wrote elaborate treatises on melancholy humors of the blood, never daring to say what everyone already knew. The pox had found a new disguise, etiquette. At the papal court in Rome, the paradox was even sharper. Pope Julius II, warrior of God and patron of Michelangelo, relied on his surgeons more than his priests. His doctors prescribed fumigations, mercurial ointments, and nightly prayers in equal measure. In the corridors of the Vatican, incense mingled with the metallic tang of medicine. Cardinals who had once debated grace now compared the merits of ointments. The divine and the diseased shared a single vocabulary: purification. The Borgia legacy lingered like a stain. Cesare, ambitious and cruel, was rumored to carry the mark of the same sin he had wielded as weapon. Chroniclers wrote that his beauty dimmed too quickly, his temper sharpened into paranoia, his skin blotched beneath layers of powder. Whether the stories were true mattered little. Syphilis had become the metaphor of corruption itself. To accuse a rival of the pox was to call him damned. In Florence, courtesans became as studied as philosophers. Veronica Franco in Venice, Imperia la Divina in Rome, Tullia d'Aragona in Florence. Their salons were universities of the body. They entertained poets, princes, and popes with equal grace. The courtesan had become a profession, an art form, a kind of secular priesthood. Yet beneath their silks, many bore the hidden signatures of the disease. They lived by beauty and died by it. Some recorded their illnesses in letters, describing with a scholar's detachment the swelling of joints, the decay of the jaw, the steady humiliation of pain. Their words survive where their bodies could not. Marriage did not save anyone. Kings infected queens. Queens gave birth to children who never thrived. Courtiers coughed discreetly into lace handkerchiefs and called it fatigue. In portraits, painters smoothed over scars and painted light where flesh had turned dull. The age of refinement was also the age of concealment. Etiquette was a form of armor. The mask, a second skin. To be visibly sick was to fall from grace, and to fall from grace was to vanish. Physicians learned the art of discretion as quickly as they learned medicine. Royal doctors were paid not for cures, but for silence. Their reports read like poetry. His Majesty's complexion is troubled by an excess of warmth. Her Grace has suffered an affection of Venus. The words said nothing and revealed everything. Those who betrayed confidence met quiet exile. In the courts of Europe, the great pox was treated less as disease than as scandal. Satirists did what physicians could not. Pamphlets and plays mocked princes and prelates alike, thinly veiled beneath allegory. In Paris, a ballad accused courtiers of bearing lilies upon their skin. The white flower of France turned ironic. In London, Thomas More wrote of the rot that follows pleasure. Artists joined the chorus. Dürer etched self-portraits in which his eyes seemed haunted by knowledge unspoken. The laughter was cruel, but the mockery was safer than pity. Yet even within the courts, not all met the disease with denial. A few physicians, shielded by royal favor, began to experiment openly. They tested combinations of Mercury and Guaiacum, counted pulses, and compared symptoms among courtiers. The palace became a laboratory disguised as salon. One Florentine doctor observed that the disease behaved differently in nobles, slower, less fatal, as if moderated by diet or privilege. He called it the gentle pox, a phrase that history would find indecently ironic. The contagion's path traced Europe's diplomacy. When ambassadors kissed the hands of queens, when royal marriages united distant houses, when treaties were sealed in shared cups of wine, the disease traveled too. It ignored borders as easily as it ignored vows. Behind the pomp of ceremony lay a quiet biological conspiracy, as if the continent's bloodlines were conspiring toward their own corruption. The Renaissance had promised harmony. It delivered inheritance. By the mid-16th century, no throne was untouched. In Spain, whispers surrounded the young Philip's pallor. In England, physicians kept coded diaries of noble distempers. In France, royal mistresses retired to convents under the guise of spiritual calling. The disease had become part of dynastic strategy, its secrecy as valuable as a treaty. A monarch's health was a nation's reputation. The irony was cruel but fitting. The Renaissance had perfected the surfaces of power: marble, silk, gold, flesh, and beneath them, decay advanced with the same artistry. The very courtly ideals of beauty, refinement, and restraint had become the instruments of concealment. Europe glittered while it rotted, polite and perfumed, and dying by degrees. From the margins, the poor watched and learned. They saw that even kings limped, that courtesans vanished, that popes grew pale. For a brief and terrible moment, The great pox made all men equal. Then the world remembered its hierarchies. The afflicted among the powerful were mourned in Latin, the rest in silence. When Paracelsus wrote that disease was the shadow cast by the body's desire, he might have been describing the century itself. In palaces and alleys alike, the shadow lengthened. No one escaped its outline. The courts that once shaped Europe's destiny were now merely mirrors, reflecting in their gilded light the slow disfigurement of an entire age. The same ships that carried gold and gospel carried contagion. As Europe expanded its borders, it exported its sickness, both moral and physical. The great pox became a stowaway on empire, a ghost in the rigging, invisible but loyal. From the ports of Seville and Lisbon, from the harbours of Bristol and Bordeaux, sailors departed with crucifixes hung around their necks and a disease nestled in their blood. Wherever they landed, the new world met the old. In an embrace, neither could survive unchanged. In the first decades of the 16th century, exploration turned to conquest. Spanish caravels traced their routes across the Caribbean, leaving behind chapels and cemeteries in equal number. The sailors who had once caught the pox in Naples now brought it to islands with no name for such suffering. The native peoples, already dying from smallpox and measles, soon faced a slower plague, one that disfigured rather than destroyed, that crept through generations rather than harvests. The missionaries wrote of it with pity and confusion. They called it mal français, unaware that the same phrase was being used for them in Seville. Guaiacum, once hailed as a miracle from the Indies, now returned to its birthplace as commerce. The Spanish loaded their ships with the timber they believed holy, carrying home both remedy and infection. In this cruel symmetry, the cure and the disease sailed the same waters. Apothecaries in Europe built fortunes on the suffering of lands they had never seen, while in those same lands, native healers watched their traditions crumble under the weight of imported faith. The age of exploration was also the age of exchange, of goods, of gods, of germs. Africa too felt the invisible tide. Portuguese traders, stopping at coastal forts along the Gulf of Guinea, left more than coins in their wake. The enslaved were examined for blemishes before being herded onto ships, yet even the healthiest carried contagion. The disease crossed the Atlantic not only in the blood of sailors, but in the bodies of captives, bound for markets where their value depended on endurance. In both directions, pain was currency. In Asia, the pattern repeated. The first Portuguese merchants to reach Goa and Malacca brought crucifixes and cannon, silk and infection. Chroniclers in India recorded a sickness that afflicts those who consort with the Franks. In China, imperial physicians described foreigners whose skin peeled away like bark from a tree. Japan, newly opened to European trade, called it Nanban Yamai, the southern barbarian disease. Even when unnamed, it was unmistakable. The Renaissance, carried eastward on sails and ambition, brought with it the symptoms of its own desire. Not all encounters were one-sided. Indigenous healers, confronted with the strange sores and fevers of the newcomers, applied their own remedies, barks, roots, and infusions unknown to European medicine. Some worked, some did not, but all were observed with fascination by the invaders. The conquistadors recorded these cures as curiosities, not realizing they were witnessing a science as old as their own. In the notebooks of explorers, medicinal plants stood beside accounts of battles and miracles, catalogues of conquest and cure intertwined. In Mexico, Franciscan friars described the disease spreading among converts, calling it the punishment of Eve renewed. They preached chastity to dying bodies, yet within their hospitals, the distinctions between native and Spaniard dissolved. The same sores, the same odors, the same prayers rose into the night. Empires had met, and their diseases had made them kin. Meanwhile, Europe continued to feed on the traffic it had created. In Lisbon's markets, blackened sailors told stories of islands where even the parrots coughed. In Seville, doctors debated whether the new strains of the pox were stronger or merely different. The disease seemed to adapt to every climate, fiercer in the tropics, subtle in the north. Some claimed it was changing again, shedding the violence of its youth. The old terror was maturing, becoming chronic, respectable. Like empire itself, it learned patience. Artists began to imagine the globe as a single, wounded body. Mapmakers decorated their charts with monsters, but the true monster was invisible. In the universities, scholars spoke of the mutatio mundi, the changing of the world. The pox had become its metaphor, a sickness born of curiosity, spread by contact, impossible to contain. In every port, the same mixture of faith and fever greeted returning ships. Priests offered blessings, physicians offered Mercury, and the people offered silence. The human stories were more tender and more cruel. A sailor might return to his wife after years at sea, bringing gifts of ivory, spices, and death. A woman might give birth to a child who bore the map of her husband's voyages upon its skin. A priest in Manila might contract the disease from a penitent. A merchant in Antwerp from a slave girl newly arrived from the islands. The world was growing smaller, and the distance between sin and suffering vanished. Even the language of the disease became global. The French called it the Indian evil, the Spanish, the illness of the Indies, the Portuguese, simply the male. Each name was an act of displacement, a refusal to see the common thread. In truth, the pox no longer belonged to any place. It was as much a part of civilization as the ships that carried it. By the mid-16th century, the great pox had completed its voyage. It circled the earth faster than any explorer, faster than any prayer. What had begun in the flesh of soldiers outside Naples now lived in the blood of the world. Every empire carried it. Every faith interpreted it. Every language cursed it. Discovery had become contagion's disguise. Still the sails unfurled. The same winds that drove Columbus, Magellan, and da Gama now spread not just the promise of empire, but the certainty of infection. Humanity had bound its destiny to movement. Wherever the cross was planted and the flag raised, the shadow of Venus fell. Soft, invisible, enduring. By the middle of the 16th century, Europe had ceased to ask where the sickness began. It was everywhere now, in cities and monasteries, in barracks and boudoirs, in the blood of kings and the breath of beggars. The great pox had settled into the rhythm of ordinary life. What had once been a crisis became a condition. Physicians wrote of it the way they wrote of age or weather. A constant presence, shaping the body quietly, persistently, until decay seemed merely another form of time. The disease no longer ravaged as it had in its youth. The first terrifying forms, the ulcers that devoured faces, had softened. What remained was slower, subtler, a lifelong affliction that marked its victims less with horror than with fatigue. The sores healed and returned, the fevers ebbed and reignited. It became a companion rather than a conqueror, unwelcome but familiar. Even language adapted. The people no longer whispered of the French disease. They simply said the pox, as if it were one more certainty of existence, like taxes or God. Hospitals turned from triage to management. In the great cities, Paris, Venice, Augsburg, London, the wards were full but calm. Surgeons no longer gasped at what they saw. They measured it. The afflicted, often disfigured but alive, learned to live within the confines of treatment. Mercury ointments, Guaiacum decoctions, fumigations, none cured, all prolonged. Medicine had made peace with failure. Patients emerged from weeks of torment, half healed, half poisoned, carrying the smell of burnt metal and cedar long after the cure was done. Artists recorded what medicine could not. Dürer's engravings showed faces shadowed by resignation, saints whose halos gleamed above bodies warped by pain. Bruegel's peasants, bent over their work, bore a tired humour that seemed to come from knowledge of endurance. The pox had entered the imagination as metaphor, a stain on beauty, a moral beneath laughter. Even the printing presses echoed it. Broadsheets printed cures beside woodcuts of monstrous deformities, turning suffering into spectacle. Europe had learned to look at its own corruption without flinching. Among the poor, the disease became part of family history. Wives buried husbands, then fell ill themselves. Children were born frail, their bones softened, their teeth scarred before they appeared. Parish registers filled with infants baptized and buried in the same week. Orphanages overflowed. The priests called it God's mystery. The midwives knew it as habit. No household was without some trace. A limp, a scar, a line of mercury along the gums. Pain, too, became hereditary. In the universities, the physicians continued their debates, their hands stained with ink and salve. They argued whether the pox was truly contagious or merely hereditary, whether its course could be predicted by stars or humours. A few began to notice its patterns, to distinguish between diseases that once had been confused. They observed that leprosy and the pox were not twins, but cousins. From this slow disentangling of illness came the first glimmers of classification, of science itself. Even ignorance, examined long enough, can become a form of knowledge. The economy bent around the affliction. Apothecaries made fortunes. Miners in Almaden died extracting the mercury that kept Europe alive. Physicians wrote treatises that served as advertisements, their titles swollen with hope, on the certain cure of the French disease, the true method of cleansing the blood. Hope sold better than honesty. Each generation inherited not only the infection, but the marketplace it sustained. In the courts, discretion matured into ritual. A prince's pallor was discussed in whispers. A noblewoman's retreat to a convent raised no questions. Portraits from this period seem almost embalmed in serenity. Painters perfected the art of idealization. Smooth flesh, steady gaze, no trace of mortality. Beneath the varnish, the world limped on. The Renaissance dream of perfect form survived only on canvas. Faith continued to wrestle with meaning. The priests who once thundered about punishment now spoke softly of endurance. The pox had outlived judgment. Confessionals filled not with sinners seeking forgiveness, but with sufferers seeking understanding. The disease no longer threatened salvation. It merely delayed it. Death had become familiar enough to be domestic. Still, outbreaks of panic flared. In Geneva and Antwerp, rumours of new, more virulent strains swept through the streets. City councils reinstated inspections, forced the sick into isolation, burned bedding and clothes. For a few weeks, it felt like the old terror had returned. Then the fear subsided and life resumed. The pox was patient. It would wait for the next generation. Beyond Europe, the story was the same. The Spanish colonies nursed both the disease and the trade in its supposed cures. African slaves carried it from coast to coast, their suffering recorded only in merchant logs. In the ports of Goa, sailors from Portugal and Arabia compared their sores in silence. The contagion had become a common language, a cruel cosmopolitanism that ignored color and creed. It was the world's first truly global affliction. By the closing years of the century, even art seemed weary of horror. The painters of the Counter-Reformation filled their canvases with redemption instead. Saints ascending, martyrs radiant, flesh perfected once more. Yet beneath the heavenly glow lay the memory of disease, a thin veil over centuries of pain. The churches smelled of incense and mercury alike. The great pox had reshaped Europe more profoundly than any war. It altered medicine, faith, and art. It redefined the boundaries of desire and the meaning of purity. It forced the continent to see the body as fragile and shared, not private or divine. The plague that had begun as punishment had become instruction. By enduring it, humanity had learned what it was. Beneath the sermons, the commerce, the beauty, it slept in the blood, quiet, stubborn, waiting. The Renaissance had promised rebirth. The pox delivered remembrance. The century ended not with triumph, but with acceptance. The understanding that some discoveries are never undone. In the early decades of the 16th century, Europe had grown accustomed to living in the company of disease. What terrified one generation became routine for the next. The great pox, though incurable, no longer shocked. It had taught scholars, priests, and princes a lesson that no sermon could contain, that the body, once celebrated as divine architecture, was also a machine of failure. From that realization came both despair and discovery. The first experiments in understanding began not with philosophers, but with surgeons. On the battlefields of Italy and Flanders, they saw bodies opened by shot and steel, their anatomy displayed by accident. The wounds of war and the sores of the pox taught the same truth. The body could be read. Ambroise Paré, tending to soldiers who rotted in their armor, abandoned the custom of cauterizing wounds with boiling oil. He found that gentle treatment saved more lives than cruelty ever had. "I dressed him, and God healed him," he wrote. A phrase that sounded like piety, but was in fact revolution. Healing, once divine monopoly, was becoming human craft. In the universities, the spirit of experiment spread. At Padua, the newly built anatomy theatre gleamed with brass lamps and white marble tiers. Its shape echoed a church. The professor standing where an altar might be, the body laid upon the table like an offering. The audience held its breath as the knife parted skin. Beneath the bright surface, secrets unfolded, veins branching like rivers, muscles strung like instruments, the organs damp and real. The disease that had once been seen as moral punishment was now studied as evidence of structure. Flesh became scripture of a different kind. Vesalius, a young scholar from Brabant, would make this vision permanent. His De Humani Corporis Fabrica, on the fabric of the human body, astonished Europe when it appeared in 1543. Its woodcut figures, drawn with almost devotional care, posed in classical landscapes as if death itself were a philosopher's model. Each engraving was both reverence and rebellion. The divine order of creation was no longer sought in heaven, but within the body's interior. The poxed cadaver, opened and observed, replaced the saint as teacher. Printing, that other invention of the age, carried this new gospel of observation across borders. Physicians who had once copied Galen by hand now read each other's doubts in cheap, quick editions. Squilasi's fearful letters from Naples, Grunpeck's lament from Augsburg, Paracelsus's furious pamphlets all circulated together, mingling panic and precision. In these pages, illness became correspondence. The pox connected scholars who might never meet, their dialogues stitched together by ink, ambition, and disbelief. Mercury's reign endured, but began to waver. Reports accumulated of patients who died cured, their mouths filled with loosened teeth and their breath metallic. Guaiacum, imported from the Indies, offered false reprieve, a cure that enriched merchants more than patients. Physicians began to note, in guarded Latin, that some remedies harmed more than they healed. In that modest observation lay the birth of empiricism, the admission that not all authority deserved belief. Paracelsus stood at the frontier of that heresy. Wandering from town to town, he burned the books of Galen and lectured under open skies. He taught that disease was not divine wrath, but natural imbalance. The body seeking correction, the physician its interpreter. He experimented with metals and minerals, predicting a future in which chemistry would replace magic. To his enemies, he was a blasphemer. To his students, a prophet. His refusal to separate healing from experiment transformed medicine from doctrine into pursuit. He who heals, he said, teaches more than he who reads. It was a dangerous sentence in an age still ruled by scripture. Hospitals, too, began to change. Once places of confinement and prayer, they turned into laboratories of observation. In Paris, the Hôtel Dieu expanded its wards. In Florence, the Ospedale degli Innocenti cared for infants marked by congenital sores. Administrators kept registers of symptoms, noting which patients survived and which did not. Mortality became data. The word patient, once meaning one who suffers, began to mean one who is studied. Compassion gave way to curiosity, not out of cruelty, but out of the conviction that to understand suffering was to master it. The church, though wary, found ways to sanctify the new curiosity. In Bologna and Padua, dissections were permitted during Lent as acts of pious instruction, proof that God's design could endure scrutiny. Some priests attended secretly, their rosaries clutched tight as knives revealed the interiors they had long imagined only in allegory. A few fainted, others wept. To cut open the human form was to trespass and to worship in the same motion. Art followed science into the body. Painters who had once perfected divine anatomy now turned their gaze inward. The sculptors of Florence studied cadavers by candlelight to capture the tension of muscle beneath marble. Anatomy informed every brushstroke of Michelangelo's prophets, every vein in a saint's hand. Beauty itself became anatomical, accuracy as devotion. The Renaissance, born from faith in proportion, ended in fascination with precision. As the century advanced, the tone of medical writing changed. Earlier treatises had mingled confession with observation. Now they spoke the language of certainty. This lesion, appearing first upon the genitals, migrates thereafter to the skin and bones, wrote one scholar in Basel. Its course is regular. The sentence was without poetry, but full of power. To classify was to control. The body, once a mystery of God, became a problem of order. Dissection, observation, and record-keeping. These quiet revolutions transformed Europe more deeply than conquest or faith. They replaced the drama of punishment with the discipline of evidence. The great pox, indifferent to dogma, had forced the living to look steadily at decay. In doing so, it gave them the habits of modern thought. Even those who still prayed for miracles began to take notes. Not everyone welcomed the new frankness. Some feared that knowledge had gone too far, that the unveiling of flesh invited sacrilege. A Venetian preacher warned that to dissect the human form was to invite judgment. Man was made in the image of God, he thundered. Who cuts that image cuts his own salvation. Yet his words found little echo. The age of divine mystery was waning. The age of anatomy had begun. The new physicians, trained in lecture halls rather than cloisters, wrote in the cool grammar of observation. Their notebooks read like maps of small territories. A sailor, aged 30, skin eroded, bones softened. Symptoms recurring after Mercury, notes 1. A courtesan, age unknown, cured twice, relapsed thrice. Each life reduced to pattern, each death a lesson. Their detachment concealed awe. The more they studied, the more the human body resembled a cosmos of its own, infinite, ordered, perilous. By centuries' end, the pursuit of knowledge had become Europe's second religion. The physician replaced the priest, the laboratory, the chapel, the microscope, the relic. Yet the new faith carried the same contradictions as the old. Knowledge could explain everything, except the reason for suffering. The pox, dissected and described, remained incurable. It had given birth to modern medicine, but refused to die by its hand. In the cold light of the anatomy theatre, students watched as the professor traced the course of a syphilitic lesion across the skull of a corpse. They leaned forward, their quills poised, their faces lit by the lamplight. Outside, snow fell quietly over the city. Inside, history shifted. The age of faith had ended not with heresy or reform, but with a scalpel cutting clean through silence. 100 years had passed since the first soldiers limped out of Naples, carrying the strange plague that would never leave them. The great pox had grown old with the century. It no longer struck with the sudden ferocity of its youth, but endured as a slow affliction woven into Europe's skin. Physicians could now describe it with precision. Theologians could moralize it without hysteria, and artists could evoke it without naming it. The disease had become history, and yet it lived quietly in the blood of a continent that had learned to live with contradiction. The Renaissance had reached its twilight. The exuberance of discovery had cooled into reflection, and the certainty that knowledge would redeem mankind had already begun to fade. Cities gleamed with marble facades and ordered streets, but behind those new walls were hospitals, orphanages, and laboratories, filled with the evidence of the century's cost. Progress had its casualties, and none was more enduring than the sickness that had forced it into being. In Paris, physicians gathered in lecture halls to argue over definitions. The pox was no longer a single calamity, but a collection of symptoms, classified and subdivided. Some claimed it had softened, that the violence of its early years had burned itself out. Others warned that its mildness was an illusion, that it had merely learned discretion like the people it infected. The arguments filled pages, but the patients kept coming, their bodies bearing quiet proof that the disease, if not divine, was certainly eternal. The moralists, too, had changed their tone. The preachers of punishment had become confessors of resignation. They spoke of moderation, of cleanliness, of marital fidelity, sermons that sounded less like prophecy than like hygiene. Sin was still invoked, but half-heartedly. The real fear was no longer divine wrath, but contagion. In this way, the language of salvation slipped imperceptibly into the language of medicine. The soul and the body were learning to share their vocabulary. In the courts, discretion hardened into diplomacy. Ambassadors were chosen as much for their health as for their wit. Marriage contracts included clauses about heirs and bloodlines, as if affection itself required notarization. Portrait painters worked longer hours to ensure that no trace of imperfection remained in their subjects. Cosmetics replaced confession. The masks of powder and lace that had once been fashion now served as camouflage. Across Europe, the laboratories of alchemists gave way to the workshops of chemists. Men who once dreamed of transmuting lead into gold now spoke of purifying the human body instead. Their instruments grew smaller, their ambitions larger. They distilled acids, separated salts, and measured the pulse. They recorded the body's rhythms with a precision that bordered on reverence. To heal had become not an act of mercy, but an act of mastery. The physician, the priest, and the alchemist had merged into a single figure, the modern man of reason. Yet the human cost remained unchanged. In the wards of London's St. Bartholomew's Hospital, women whispered the same prayers as their sisters had in Naples a century earlier. Their bodies told the same stories: swelling joints, broken bones, the sweet stench of Mercury. Some survived, most did not. In Seville, the foundling hospitals overflowed with infants who bore the unmistakable signs of congenital infection. Flattened noses, skin pale as wax, eyes clouded before they could see. The church baptized them swiftly, as if speed could stand in for grace. There were no saints of the pox, only witnesses. The disease had lost its novelty, and with it, its terror. It was no longer a herald of apocalypse, but a companion to civilization. The same century that charted the heavens and mapped the globe could not cure its own flesh. It learned instead to manage decay, to catalogue it, diagnose it, even aestheticize it. Pain became a kind of discipline, endurance a form of piety. Out of suffering, Europe had fashioned order. Art mirrored that transformation. The exuberant colour of the early Renaissance gave way to the austerity of the Baroque. Painters filled their canvases with light so violent it seemed to pierce the flesh. Saints and martyrs glowed not with ecstasy, but with fever. Caravaggio's figures, carved from shadow, bore the realism of bodies studied too closely. Their beauty was knowledge's revenge, the elegance of decay. Viewers recognized something of themselves in those half-lit faces, though they would never admit it. In the universities, a new generation of physicians wrote their treatises with the confidence of men who believed that ignorance could be conquered by system. They classified diseases by symptom, by organ, by temperament. The body was a library to be indexed. Even the pox found its place on the shelf, its stages numbered, its progression graphed. The infection that once defied explanation had become a chapter in textbooks. For the first time, the possibility of control seemed real. Still, in taverns, brothels, and battlefields, the old patterns continued. Soldiers returned from the Netherlands or the New World, bearing the same affliction, the same shame. The poor died in the same beds, beneath the same prayers. The physician's triumph was one of knowledge, not mercy. They could describe the disease with exquisite accuracy, its lesions, its timing, its phases. But they could not stop it. To understand was not to undo. The world itself had changed beyond recognition. The printing press, once the servant of humanism, now served bureaucracy. Records multiplied: births, deaths, marriages, infections, the accounting of life as administration. The same impulse that had mapped the stars now mapped the sick. The great pox had helped teach Europe the language of record, of evidence, of proof. Its suffering had given the modern world its instruments of control. Across the oceans, the contagion lived on, woven into the fabric of empire. In the Americas, native populations decimated by European diseases still suffered its remnants. In Africa, it lingered among the enslaved. In Asia, it travelled with missionaries and merchants, as familiar as prayer. The disease that had once carried Europe's shame had become one of its exports, as enduring as its faith and its greed. By the closing years of the century, syphilis, for at last it had a settled name, was no longer a novelty, but an inheritance. The poets spoke of it only in metaphor, the corruption of the heart, the worm within the rose. Physicians debated its course with the calm of experience. Artists hinted at it in the droop of a mouth, the shadow beneath a collar. The terror had faded, but the mark remained. The pox had not disappeared. It had become civilization's texture, invisible, omnipresent, assumed. The Renaissance had begun with the rediscovery of the human form. It ended with the understanding that form was fragile. Knowledge had grown vast, but comfort had not kept pace. The disease had taught Europe to look inward, to see the body not as perfection, but as process, mutable, vulnerable, mortal. That realization, more than any invention or conquest, was its true legacy. In the quiet of the new century, physicians continued their work by candlelight. They dipped quills into ink made from soot and saltpeter, their hands steady from habit. Outside, the city hummed with the confidence of progress. Presses running, bells ringing, carts creaking under the weight of commerce. Inside, the scholars wrote the same conclusion, in different words. The sickness endures, and with it, our desire to understand it. The first century of the great pox had closed, but humanity's instinct to survive its own plagues was only beginning to tell its tale.